So it's my great pleasure to have again a real friend of freedom of religion South Africa DearSA on this Zoom opportunity call with me today. Rob Hutchinson of DearSA, Dear South Africa, who does a fantastic job helping the public to engage and has certainly worked together with DearSA to engage on several now of really key issues that affect religious freedom, among other freedoms that are potentially jeopardized by some of the bills and regulations that we're facing. And we're talking today specifically, Rob, about the protection of constitutional democracy against terrorism and related activity bills. Wow, that is already quite a mouthful. And I know that this is something which you have been pushing quite strongly. And I want to just ask the question, why should we be concerned about this bill, generally speaking?
Well, there's a very good reason we should all be concerned. And when I say we all, I think it's just individuals and even down to individuals, non-profit organizations, church groups, anybody that does run non-profit activities or is outspoken about political views and governmental views and policy and so on. It has incredibly loose definitions around what is a terrorist, what constitutes a terrorist, and what constitutes the terrorist activities as well. And that leaves it open for government interpretation to literally attack anyone who goes against what the government is proposing at the time. And I can give you a great example, actually, Michael. Recently, we were labeled as a terrorist group and terrorist organization, undermining democratic purposes or democratic processes in Parliament, simply because we sent through 300,000 public comments to government on the amendments, and Parliament came back and actually labelled us in writing as a terrorist organisation. Had this bill been in place, Parliament would have had the right to take that matter further. We could have been prosecuted, and possibly much more than that. And it doesn't just doesn't just apply to us, but would have applied to all 300,000 participants, or 300,000 people who had their say.
Wow, so, I mean that is immediately very concerning, because that was the campaign that we liaised very closely with you upon, and we recommended strongly that people engaged with it. Speaking about the health regulations, or the draft health regulations, which effectively were going to create potentially an unaccountable executive that could do pretty much whatever it wanted to rule us with almost no form of accountability. So you're saying that not only were you, which is, I think, already shocking enough, labeled as a domestic terrorist or terrorism organization, but all those people who participated in effectively what was a free, open, democratic, constitutionally permitted process.
Yeah, I think that's a great point as well. The bill's labelled as protecting a democratic society and protecting democracy. Yet it's in its application, it does the complete opposite. It undermines democracy and the democratic processes, which are guaranteed in the Constitution. And as we know, the Constitution of South Africa is the supreme law of the land. So this bill in itself is more than likely unconstitutional. However, at this stage, it will have to be tested in court, and that in itself is a lengthy and expensive process. And we'd like to catch it before it actually gets signed into law through public pressure.
Yes, I think one of the things that we've seen in the past is that once something does become law, is enacted and signed into law by the president at the end of this process, then to actually have that challenged or reversed is very costly and time-consuming and fairly ineffective in a way, because as we saw with, for example, the definition of hate speech in the original PAPUDA, the so-called Equality Act, that definition was signed off in the year 2000, and it took literally 21 days before the Constitutional Court basically declared that to be unlawful and unconstitutional and effectively rewrote it and gave Parliament now the responsibility for amending that act. But for 21 years, an unlawful, unconstitutional definition of hate speech has been in force and enforceable. And so what you're saying here, I think, is that in terms of this, let's call it sort of terrorism amendment act, potentially this gives the government the opportunity to label who exactly is terrorists. I mean, they labeled you, but under what grounds? Just maybe you could amplify the grounds and particularly think about the religious faith communities, because you would like to think that, and is very much the case, that people who are part of those communities, leading those communities, the organizations that they lead, they are very much a benevolent and beneficial organizations for society. Why would there be a threat to those organizations and the constituencies that we might represent to be labeled as terrorists or terrorist organizations, or to be engaged in terrorist activities?
Well, government has realized that civil society in the form of organized groups is an immensely powerful force in influencing government decisions, influencing bills, laws and legislation. And I'm sure that because of us being so outspoken, and yourselves and your groups also being outspoken lately, there seems to be a clampdown on what government wants to do. So, sorry. So that is a problem. Sorry about the noise there. So that is a problem, and government sees it as a problem. And the only way to curb it is to loosely define what is terrorism. It's all built under the guise of keeping South Africa outside of being grey listed, which in itself is brought about by an international group, or pressure from an international group. I think it's the Financial Action Task Force. But that can be housed under financial laws. It doesn't have to be housed under this amendment bill. This amendment bill is an amendment to existing legislation. The existing legislation has been adequate in the past. There's no doubt about that. It's actually proven to be pretty effective, and it has assisted in apprehending suspected terrorists and even stopping terrorist funding in South Africa quite recently. So while this amendment comes about is quite a touchy subject, and very questionable in the same breath, I think it is definitely a move to curb civil society, into both individuals and organizations, and keep the voices of dissent or opposition quite low. And as we know, civil society and church groups in particular have a great influence on politics and political outcomes.
Yes, I was thinking that obviously one of the things that we've been very aware of and alert to, even over the years, has been the, let's say, unintended consequences of some of the legislation that we've seen, some of the reports that have come out of commissions to basically bring increasing levels of state control over the religious sector. Because, as you say, that is one sector of society over which government really does not have very much control presently, certainly, in terms of what we say and what people say, and nor should it have. Obviously, it is absolutely critical that the freedom to express your faith and even the views of your faith, whether or not they contradict whatever the government might want or even be promulgating, they should be, at the very least, allowed to be heard without fear of some form of sanction. So what are the overarching, perhaps, concerns that we should be looking out for? And what are the potential sanctions that can come against people if they should fall foul, or even organizations if they should fall foul of that?
Well, it's quite simple. All we have to do is look back to the apartheid era, where certain laws were used to deem people as, or label people as terrorists, and then they were thrown in jail as political dissidents and jailed for many years. It's not unlikely to assume that this would happen again, especially as our government seems to be on the edge of failure and grasping at straws, trying to find a resource, trying to recover their image and so on. They will grasp at anything. And I think the scariest thing here is it could definitely be used as a tool to silence political opposition, and especially individuals within other political parties and influential people within civil society. They could be individually targeted. You could say something wrong about the government on social media or on even WhatsApp or communication programs or anything in a normal day-to-day speech. The definitions are that loose that they leave anything open to the government to decide what is actually a terrorist act.
So government basically has an almost open-ended discretion to put a label on with pretty significant sanctions. So give us an illustration, perhaps, of what type of sanctions would you be likely to face if you are falling foul, if you like, or if you are defined or labeled as a terrorist or to be involved in terrorist activity.
Yeah, well, we've had examples in the past where individuals have been apprehended. It's a global initiative, so you could be subject to global and international laws and the consequences of breaking those laws as well. There'd probably be a court case or a prosecution on an individual, a full investigation. The individual could be detained indefinitely under terrorism acts. And as far as I recall, there doesn't even need to be due process in a case of suspected terrorism. Government can hold you for a certain amount of time without any evidence, based on pure suspicion. So I think that's a big danger for anyone. If, say, you're doing a protest or hand delivering something to government, or doing simply what we do as organizations, deliver public comment, you could be seen as instigating terrorism and encouraging terrorism. And I think the word, the encouragement, is the big problem in this bill. What exactly does encouraging terrorist activity mean? And that's not clearly defined or explained in the bill. So as you correctly said, it's loosely open to interpretation and abuse by government.
I think I've noted, obviously, internationally, when you were looking at, for example, the truckers' protests that took place in Canada, for example, and some of the protests that have been taking place in the US in the schooling context over, certain transgender policies that are being rolled out into public schools. And again, in that instance in Canada, truckers who basically, so far as one could tell, were just simply exercising their right to peaceful protest, were very strongly targeted, and pretty draconian legislation was basically enforced to shut them down. And then in the US, there was some form of investigation into parents as domestic terrorists for simply being concerned about the well-being of their own children. Is it the sort of thing that you would see this applying to potentially?
Exactly that. And just to further on your point there, it wasn't just the truckers in the case of the Canadian protest. It was actually the people who funded the truckers as well, had their bank accounts seized, frozen, assets investigated, and so on, all under the guise of domestic terrorism.
Yes, I noticed in one of the legal opinions on this particular South African bill that potentially crowdfunding would be able to be targeted by it. And I do recall that the crowdfunding that was raised, for example, in support of the Canadian truckers was basically pretty much hijacked and never actually went for its intended purpose. And also those who, as you said, contributed were themselves subject to sanction.
Exactly, Michael. And that is exactly what we're facing here. This bill is, as I said, is a part of an international move to curb terrorism and terrorism funding. South Africa is, interesting enough, being identified as a hotspot for this kind of activity and a hub for terrorism funding, and organization and so forth. But as I said, we have curbed it in the past using existing legislation. So modifying the legislation to include these draconian acts and definite overcroach or encroach on human rights is really questionable and highly dangerous as well. We cannot let this pass.
So we've got until the 18th of October to actually send in submissions, and I know that you have on the DearSA platform a submission opportunity for people to respond digitally to this. Do you want to just give us some of the details of that?
Yeah, sure. It's a very simple process. You can either send in your submission to government or your comment directly to government, but we encourage people to use the platform as then we have a record of the public participation, and that record can be used in a court case should it be necessary. You just go to dearsouthafrica.co.za, find the latest campaign, which will be on the front page, and that will be the terrorism act bill, be the first one I think it is on our page. Click on that, enter your name, your surname, your email address, and select what is of main concern to you within the bill, and then justify your selection. And we do encourage people to actually put in a comment, as government looks at the quality of the content rather than the quantity. So it's not a petition, it's not a voting system, it's your opportunity to actually influence this bill, provide suggestions, alternatives, and so on.
So Rob, thank you so much for this. And as we DearSA say so often when we've engaged in these matters and when we partnered with DearSA, your voice counts, every voice counts. And the more voices that are raised, the louder that voice becomes and the more potential there is to use that block of voices, so to speak, that volume of voices to push back against what is clearly something of great concern. Again, often we say that these things might be benign or seemingly benevolent, but the unintended consequences are what can be very serious. And I think it's germane to point out that the last campaign that we did seems to have already triggered that level of response or potential response against DearSA. And I would imagine, therefore, potentially by association DearSA, because we were on the front page with you co-branding that campaign, as we are on this campaign as well. So we just want to encourage everybody before the 18th of October, take a moment, literally 2 minutes, to make sure that your voice is heard, and let's be engaged in the legitimate democratic processes of this great country. So thank you so much, Rob.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you very much.
Good day. This is Daniela Ellerbeck, the Legal Advisor to Freedom of Religion South Africa. Remember to like and share this video, and then click on the subscribe button to make sure you never miss our video updates on vital religious freedom issues.